good evening. Welcome to Newsmakers, a co-production between the Epoch Times and NTD. I'm Joshua Phillip.
And I'm Tiffany Meyer. We have a great lineup of guests for you tonight, covering some of the big headlines in the news. We'll bring them on shortly. But first, Josh, what have you been following?
Well, we begin tonight's broadcast with a topic I think everyone's been following, an update on the midterms. Now, control of Congress is still up for grabs. Republicans are projected to take the House, but only a few votes really are there right now. They might not win by a whole lot. And the Senate still is a toss-up. Now, this is quite different from the red tsunami and red waves that people were projecting ahead of the midterms. It seems right now like polling data did not work well for the Republicans, at least this time around. Now, what went wrong? We'll be touching on that with some of our guests tonight, but first, an update on where things are at. Now, key places to watch. In Pennsylvania, it was a close race between John Fetterman and Mehmet Oz, but Oz ended up conceding his Senate race late this afternoon, meaning Democrats were able to flip that Senate seat. Now, in Georgia, the Senate race is close enough right now that under local law, they have to have a runoff election, meaning we won't know the results in Georgia for another month or so. Currently, all eyes are on Nevada and on Arizona. Under Nevada's law, mail-in ballots postmarked by Election Day but delivered by November 12th are still being counted, meaning we may not know what's happening there as well for several days. And similarly in Arizona, as of this morning, around 60% of the votes were counted in the state, many more to come. Also important to watch in Arizona, the governor's race between Katie Hobbs and Kari Lake. Votes are still being counted, and there is some potential for change there. If Republicans take the House as they're projected to, they are still projected to, we'll see what happens, that means a change with the Speaker. Kevin McCarthy is expected to take over from Nancy Pelosi. That also means Republicans will gain control of the investigative committees. That could mean a January 6th investigative committee under the Republicans, potential investigations into Hunter Biden, as well as final results, and we'll see what happens with this. We can expect some lawsuits, challenges over any anomalies we saw, signature verification, undated ballots, late ballots, other issues. And one of the areas cited as well as helping fuel the Democrats from losing was Gen Z, 18 to 29-year-olds, who saw large turnouts.
And it seems there are a lot of issues that came into the spotlight in this election, right? We have the economy, abortion, crime, immigration, all of these different things playing out in different states. So it's really fascinating to see how that has been playing out. That's been a little different from the polling that we have been seeing. What were some of the surprises you saw most?
Well, that was one of the big surprises. Really, all the polling data showed that Republicans would have a tsunami. People are wondering what the heck happened, to be honest. Now, data coming out early on, people were saying it's the economy, this is what voters care about the most. Biden actually started talking about the economy, started pivoting to that. We see that things did not work out well for Republicans. People are basically looking at the kind of scenery right now and trying to figure out what happened. We don't have strong answers on that yet, but they're suggesting that maybe it was young voters, maybe it was abortion topics, maybe it was something else.
Definitely a lot to watch there. And actually joining us now to discuss this and the midterms is Pete Hoekstra. He's the former ambassador to the Netherlands during the Trump administration. He served 18 years in the U.S. House of Representatives representing the 2nd District of Michigan. And he also served as the chairman and ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee. And he is currently the chairman of the Center for Security Policies and Board of Advisors. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, great. Very good to be with you. Thank you.
So let's begin with the midterm. So control of Congress is still up in the air. The projected red tsunami or a red wave seems to have become a drizzle. So to begin, what went wrong for the Republicans?
Well, I think a couple of things. You're going to have two sets of activities going on right now. You're going to have the political pollsters, the pundits, and the experts within the Republican Party taking a look and trying to get exactly to that answer. Did we address the wrong set of issues? Did we ignore the issue of abortion? Did we not address, did we not give the American people a positive message What other outside factors came in? Didn't we have enough money? Did we run a poor ground game? Those are all the kinds of questions that people are going to be asking over the next couple of months. On the other side, you've got, Republicans are going to take control of the House of Representatives. We don't know by how much, but that is a massive change. I went through that a couple of times when, 1995, when for the first time Republicans were in the majority for 40 years. Republicans in the House most likely are very, very excited. I don't think they're going to hold, Leader McCarthy or the head of the NRCC, the campaign committee, Tom Emmer, accountable and say it's your fault that we didn't have a wave. So they're now planning about, what future committee assignments they're going to have, what kind of staff they're going to hire, where they're going to be a chairman of a full committee, of a subcommittee, and those types of things, and what their agenda is going to be. So, some people are going to be looking at the election. The people in the House of Representatives, the new majority, they're looking at what it means for them.
And, Ambassador, one of the big issues heading into the midterms was the economy, at least based on polling. Now, for the Biden administration, a big focus instead was on climate, green energy revolution. How do you see these two things playing out, the green agenda and the economy agenda?
Well, I think what you're going to see is, and you're absolutely right, this is one of the key questions that people are going to focus on. How can you have wrong track, right track be 75% of the American people saying that you're on the wrong track and only pick up like 10 to 15 seats in the House, and maybe not even pick up a net gain of, you'll have a net gain potentially of 0 seats in the Senate? How did that happen? But with the Republicans in control of the House, I think what you're going to see is from an economic standpoint, Republicans are going to put a lot of pressure on the Biden administration to do an all-above strategy on energy. They're going to do everything that they can to control federal government spending. Joe Biden's not going to be able to get any new trillion-dollar spending plans. And, he's also now going to have to, the Biden administration will be, there will be a sideshow of investigations, meaning the administration won't be able to be focused on legislating their policy agenda and those types of things. They're going to be called in front of Congress to explain the policies they put in place, whether it's the border crisis or whether it is Hunter Biden's laptop.
On that point too, how consequential is it if they don't win the Senate?
They're going to be able to do a lot by just controlling the House of Representatives by having one House. But in terms of being able to put pressure on the administration, Republicans having 51 seats in the Senate would be significant. Then, you can actually have the legislative branch teaming up with each other to confront the executive branch.
And, I guess just one last question on that. Is it really, they can kind of block everything from the House anyways. Does it really matter that much? And having, control over the House, could Biden just do what Obama did and just rule by decree, executive orders essentially?
Oh, absolutely. There's a tremendous amount of power in the in having that executive pen and to write executive orders. There's a tremendous amount of stuff that still can be accomplished through executive order. The problem with executive orders is that whatever Biden puts in place through executive orders can be repealed on day one when there's a president of the other party. What happens in 2024? If a Republican wins, he can stop all of that stuff on day one with the same pen that President Biden would be using. The one thing that you would get in the Senate if you have 51 Republicans is that you would have the power of confirmations. Okay, so that that would be a tremendous opportunity again for the legislative branch to negotiate and reach agreements saying, Mr. President, we're not going to approve these nominees of yours unless you concede different points from a legislative standpoint.
Yeah, Ambassador, thank you so much for being here.
Good to be with you. Thank you.
Yeah, you know, another big point now is election integrity, and I know a lot of people are focused on this. Let's just be real about it. Conservatives especially were, of course, I think one of the top concerns is whether the votes actually get counted. Democrats were accusing them of being election deniers, topics like this. And, you know, with that, I think people are looking and wondering, well, was there any kind of fraud? I can say right now, we've been following it. We were looking for news on the ground. There were absolutely some anomalies, such as, for example, the voting systems breaking down. Arizona is a great example of this. People went to vote. They couldn't vote. There's mixed news on what that was. Different reports came out later saying that it was scanners or printers that had errors. People couldn't cast their votes. They fixed it later. They tried changing. A Republican National Committee actually sued to allow for later voting because people could not even vote earlier. And that's important for Republicans because more Republicans were voting the same day. More Democrats, at least according to reports, were voting by mail-in ballots or early voting. Now, if Republicans could not vote, then what do if they couldn't vote that day? And that's when most of their votes come in. Well, the Republican National Committee sued to allow them, specifically in Arizona, to have a few extra hours to be able to cast their votes. One of the courts blocked that. And of course, that's going to impact very possibly what's happening in Arizona. As we mentioned right now, Kari Lake is on the trajectory to win, but it's a very, very narrow margin. And Tiffany, I'm wondering too, I mean, have you been hearing much about any kind of fraud, or what are you hearing on this?
Well, I don't know specifically about fraud, but we have been hearing reports about election interference, especially from China and other countries like Russia. I mean, we've heard this in the past, right?
Yeah, I feel like I've heard that Russia narrative before.
But like going into these midterms, we did have reports of Twitter shutting down like 2,000 accounts associated with China. You see TikTok that I think didn't block around like 75% of the misinformation surrounding the election, this midterm election. So there's definitely a lot there to think about too, and like what might have, you know, convinced voters to maybe vote one way instead of another way, because a lot of these are very polarizing accounts that tries to divide Americans, especially voters.
And we did see that previously. And I mean, being real, there were some reports of Russian disinformation that were valid back even in 2016. But the important part with that is it was not what people said it was. If you read the actual reports, it said that basically Russia was organizing the far right and the far left. They were going for Trump. They were also going, not calling Trump far right, but they were going for example, Trump. They were also going for Bernie Sanders. They weren't necessarily trying to get one person to win or the other. They were trying to cause chaos within the American system and specifically trying to organize protests of one group and another, like right next to each other. They were trying to cause conflict is what they were doing. And of course, it was not on a large scale, at least of what was actually proven. Now, given that, we will see what comes out with the current situation. Really, in the current elections, the recent midterms, we're going to be hearing a lot more very likely about mail-in ballots, early voting, signature verification, missing dates on ballots. Those are the topics, currently at least, we're probably going to be hearing the most about. Now, sorry. Yeah, sorry, folks. Joining us now is Hogan Gidley. He's the director for the Center for Election Integrity, here to talk about some of this with us. He's at America First Policy Institute. He's also the former deputy press secretary for Donald Trump. And Hogan, thanks so much for joining us today. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for the time. I really appreciate it.
Now, you know, to start, rumor has it Trump's planning to announce his 2024 run. Do you have any updates on this? Have you heard anything? Is this just a rumor? Where are things at?
Well, I was with him this past weekend, talked to him on the phone a couple of times as well. He's fired up. I can tell you this, he doesn't really care for the way that the government is treating the American people. It's almost the same type of mentality that had him jump off the sidelines in 2016 and run way back then. It looks like now he's kind of looking around, talking to people. He doesn't like the direction of the country. And look, he's a billionaire. He has a wonderful, amazing golf course in Florida. Has several actually, and many around the world. He doesn't have to do any of this, but he's most definitely looking at it again. I'm not exactly sure what the announcement is going to be next week, but the America First Policy Institute actually has our big summit and gala the end of next week on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, culminating with a speech from Donald Trump. So theoretically, if he decides to announce on Tuesday, his first kind of public appearance after that announcement will be at our gala. So it looks like we're going to have a big crowd, a raucous crowd, and we may have a presidential candidate as a speaker as opposed to just a former president.
Wow. And Hogan, it seems one of the big things Trump did was have election watchers around the country to report any anomalies. So going forward, do you see any lawsuits brewing, especially with these midterms?
I do. We've seen a few actually pop up in Arizona with Harmeet Dillon and others, and working in coordination with the Kerry Lake campaign over there. And look, one of the things we wanted to focus on in this cycle at the Center for Election Integrity is making sure you had eyes in the room. As I always like to say, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And what we saw after COVID was a lot of people decided to get involved all the way down to the local level and do school board races, for example. If there's one thing the right hates, it's transparency, whether it's with transing our kids behind our back, whether it's teaching critical race theory and not telling parents about it, or whether it's election integrity. And so they don't like us to look behind the curtain. And one of the things we made sure we had was a massive network of people all across this country in several targeted states who could go into these precincts, make sure things were happening the right way. Obviously, the reports came out of Arizona, and while I'm sure a lot of your viewers are out there going, wait a minute, what happened? Because all these things were going on. The reason we know about that is because people were there. People were trained. People were ready to ask these questions and actually put video online and tip off various hotlines. We trained them, prepared them. We wanted to make sure that the army of folks nationwide, poll watchers and poll workers, were ready to go. And it turns out they were. Now, in large measure, I think this race went fairly smooth, but there are a lot of instances, a lot of little pockets around the country, in Georgia, also Arizona, of course, and Pennsylvania, y'all were talking about before I came on, where we had some issues. And, I always laugh at like the fake news, for example, that when they make a mistake, have you ever noticed how it never cuts in the favor of a conservative? You notice when there's a big tech algorithm that malfunctions, it never malfunctions, in favor of someone on the right. The same thing applies to these issues in Maricopa. Notice how they weren't really in Democrat-heavy areas. They were only in Republican areas. That's obviously a little bit confusing. But states like Florida have it right. I mean, look, they were embarrassed in the year 2000. They had dimpled chads and hanging ballots and the whole thing. And that's all been replaced with mass mail-in and drop boxes. But there are still concerns out there. We need to address those things because the faith, trust, and confidence in our election system has gone downhill quite a bit in the last decades. And the states that actually put forth significant voter protection laws, what do you know? Their turnout was a whole lot higher than it had been in the past, because when people feel secure in something, they get out and participate in it. So we're trying to make sure that other states kind of take a look at Florida as a model and say, how can we take some of the things that would work there and implement them in our states and educate all of the stakeholders, the legislatures, the business leaders, the grassroots organizations, and try and get them on the same page with protecting every legal vote and every legal voter.
Now, Hogan, what about the election officials? Now, you wrote recently about holding them accountable. What do you want to hold them accountable on?
Well, it's interesting because there have been very well-documented instances of illegalities, irregularities, fraud, and anomalies across this country. And I can't for the life of me figure out what's going on with some of these election officials, because it continues to happen in these states kind of like clockwork. Every single cycle we have bigger and bigger problems, or the same issues that happen in the primaries happen in the general, and no one's held to account. So, whether through ignorance or stupidity or laziness or maliciousness, laws are being broken in these various states, and no one's holding them to account. In fact, in many instances, some of the things that are going on, they should be, at the very least, kicked out of office, fined, or put in jail, or a combination of all three. And rarely do any of those things come to bear. And I'll make this point. At the Center for Election Integrity, we did a deep dive into a lot of these states to see whether or not they were following the 1960 Civil Rights Act and keeping all of their election data for 22 months after a federal election. Now, since the 2020 election, that date's come and gone. It was September 3rd, but we took a look at the top 14 swing states, the top 100 most populated counties in those swing states. Only 6 had any of the data, only 6. And the 6 out of 100 of the 6, massive discrepancies. Miami-Dade is a great example of that. You just saw, obviously, Ron DeSantis win that county for the first time in a long time. The right did something good there. But I will tell you, in the 2020 election, we took a look at the number of people who voted and compared that to the number of ballots that were counted. They didn't match anywhere. Miami-Dade was a great example. 16,000 discrepancies in that particular county alone. That's one county. Now you may say, but that's a big state. 16,000. What does that matter? I don't know. Ask Senator Scott from the great state of Florida. He won the last election by 10,000 votes. So obviously these numbers are big. Obviously they're problematic. So we're working with secretaries of state now. We're putting them on notice. You better keep this data, because if not, you're in violation of federal law. Now, the problem with that is the only entity responsible for actually, holding people's feet to the fire here, the only person who can, enforce that law is Merrick Garland. Well, he's too focused on calling parents concerned about curriculum terrorists. So I doubt he's actually going to look into it. But someone needs to start to make more of an issue of this, because at the Center for Election Integrity, we sure are. We're going across the country explaining the problem. These elected officials are not following federal law. It's the 1960 Civil Rights Act. And by the way, if it were Donald Trump at the White House, they'd be quite concerned about it.
Yeah, Hogan, important work you're doing. Thank you so much. As the information comes out, I'd love to have you on again talking about this. Thank you so much for being here.
Anytime. Thanks so much.
Now, coming up after the break, we have Ken Blackwell, former Ohio State Treasurer and Secretary of State. Blackwell also tells the ambassador to the United Nations Commission on Human Rights under President Bush. That's coming up after the break.
Everything that's reported on television isn't always true, but it should be. NTD, the power of truth. Now available 24/7 on television and streaming platforms.
NTD's Capitol Report. It's about getting answers, cutting through the fog of politics. It's about your questions and our chances to ask.
What is the net impact of the American? Congressman Graves, thank you for joining us.
We're speaking to those in power to find out what does this mean for the people. We're here so you're in the know.
Navigating a world of economic madness, you need to have the right guide. What do today's decisions mean for your tomorrow? We ask why. What's the alternative? Uncover the deeper reasons and the hidden influences, and highlight the real opportunities for profit. At NTD Business, we connect the dots for you. Good evening. Thanks for joining us. NTD Business. I'm Paul Green.
At The Nation Speaks, we don't just scratch the surface. We want to go wide and deep. Our viewers come away with a much richer understanding of the issues of the day. We really make a big effort to bring on different voices onto the show. We don't just talk to experts and newsmakers, which of course are extremely important, but we also want to hear from the American people. So the people who are impacted by the policies and issues that we're talking about, because what they have to say is just as important to the national conversation.
Welcome back to Newsmakers. Joining us now is Ken Blackwell. He's the former Ohio State Treasurer and Secretary of State, and Blackwell was also the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Commission on Human Rights under President Bush. Ken, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you with us.
It's good to be with you all.
So Ken, to begin, the midterms didn't turn out quite the way Republicans were expecting, given recent polling about a red tsunami. So what do you think went wrong for them?
Well, I don't actually think anything went wrong. There is a realignment taking place in our country. We've seen a shift in the House of Representatives, which means that we can put the brakes on the runaway spending. We, in fact, can start serious negotiations to move us back towards energy independence. And I actually think that we're going to go into December 6th with 50 or 51 seats on the Senate. But if we don't have 51, that means that game day, December the 6th, everything will be on the line. And not only will we have the ability to block in the House on spending issues, we should be able to block this sort of push towards judicial activism that the Biden administration is set to put in play as we go forward over the next 2 years of his administration.
Well, on that too, actually Trump said something very similar to what you just said. He was on Truth Social, and one of the things he made a point of is he claimed, fake news is trying to make it seem like Republicans got squashed. He says actually it's pretty significant. I mean, not his exact words, of course. Trump seemed very positive, in other words, about election night, about the midterms. You seem to also believe this is positive. I know that the projections were a lot higher. Why is this still positive in your eyes?
Well, I think one, the pollsters probably overcompensated for having underrepresented Republicans in their polling in the past, and gave us a head fake on the size of the wave. But I think what's important to remember is that in 2020, everybody was predicting that we would lose seats in the House of Representatives, and we didn't. And we came real close to overtaking Nancy Pelosi in 2020. So we haven't had a tidal wave in the House, but we've had, building ripples. And so at the end of the counting of this cycle, I think we'll have a comfortable governing majority in the House, and I think we'll be real close to having a governing, although it be slim, majority in the Senate. The other thing about what we have to remember is that we have picked up governorships. We now control more state legislative chambers than the opposition party. So we can't be gaslighted into having our folks believe that we're some sort of political weakling. This is a major party in our country, and we are a force that can get us back to a growing economy, economic independence, and putting people not only back to work, but protecting the family as the incubator of liberty. We will put a stop to this big government socialist attempt to radically transform this constitutional republic that we proudly call the United States of America.
And Ken, speaking of Trump and his good feelings with this election, he's expected to announce his 2024 presidential run. So given what we just saw in the swing states in these midterm elections, what lessons should Trump and or other candidates planning on running take away from this?
Well, look, President Trump, if he announces next week, he understands that we as a political force in this country, the Republican Party, in its broadening of its base, must keep its collective shoulder to the wheel. We can't sit around and self-congratulate. We, in fact, have to understand that we have plenty of work to do, and we need to get on making sure that we put a spotlight on the deficiencies of what I call the Biden clown car that left our folks in Afghanistan, has made us, put us in a position where we're begging tyrants across the country to give us a break when we on oil when we in fact were energy independent. And so, look, I think we have to keep the spotlight on the deficiencies of the opposition party and the Biden clown car.
Now, Ken, just 30 seconds left. Are there any issues you think Republicans need to address that didn't address last time going into the 2024 elections?
Well, I think we just have to read more clearly what we see happening. This Republican Party is a more diverse party. It's a party that is speaking to Hispanics and Blacks and Asians, and we've seen real progress made in redefining our base. We, in fact, embrace more of working America than the Democrat Party, which is an elitist party now. And I think that will be played out over the next cycle also, with victories.
Okay, Ken Blackwell, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Good to be with you all.
Yeah, and actually, you made a good point. I was looking actually at donor data between Republicans and Democrats, specifically donations to Donald Trump, donations to Joe Biden. And there's something really interesting in it, which is if you look at the donors for the Democrats, it mostly is, as Ken mentioned, the elite. It's doctors, it's CEOs, it's the people who are higher up in positions. Whereas the ones donating to Republicans are the truck drivers, they're the laborers, they're the people who are not technically, you wouldn't call the elite, but they're kind of the bread and butter of the country. It is interesting we don't see Republicans taking advantage of that more. As Ken mentioned, they are kind of like the big tent party. They are the little guy. And that dynamic has shifted a lot from where Democrats used to be, where Democrats used to at least say they represented the little guy. It's a very interesting shift that they haven't fully taken advantage of, I'd say. All right, folks, coming up after the break, we have Gordon Sondland, former ambassador to the European Union, author of the new book, Envoy. Now, in just a minute, here on Newsmakers.
It's just clear as day. The media, whether it's broadcast, cable, or print media, has become extremely biased. And I started looking online for alternative ways to get information. And I saw an ad for a free trial. And I looked at it and I said, Epoch Times. I mean, come on, this is end of days type of stuff. I mean, what are they going to be talking about here? And I said, well, it's a free trial. Let me dig in. Is it giving me both sides? Is it giving me an objective point of view here? I have looked for opportunities to see where they might be biased, and I don't find it. It has given me a level of trust in media that I didn't think I'd ever get back. I love the Epoch Times because it has renewed my faith in the idea that a reliable, responsible, non-biased source of information is available. And I can say that I love it because of that.
Good evening. Thanks for joining us.
There's reporting that can be trusted. There are programs that can inspire every generation. There is a television network worth watching and sharing. Our commitment is to bring you the facts and to show you the world. We won't be divided by politics, and we won't be swayed by the dollar. We believe in the strength of our nation and the hope in our shared humanity. We are NTD Television, and we are proud to bring you news you can trust and programs that make you smile. NTD Television, now available 24/7 on television and streaming platforms.
Joining us now is Gordon Sondland, former U.S. ambassador to the European Union, author of the new book, Envoy. Now, Gordon, thank you for being here with us.
Good evening. How are you?
Hey, thank you. Gordon, you're the former ambassador to the European Union. Two of the big issues right now for Europe and the U.S. are Ukraine and the energy crisis in Europe. Where do you see this heading?
Well, listen, it's heading exactly the way our team told the Europeans that it would head if they persisted in pursuing cheap Russian energy through Nord Stream and Nord Stream 2. And that also Vladimir Putin had a propensity for using that energy as leverage in the event of some type of an international crisis. At the time, we were laughed out of the room. In fact, when President Trump gave a speech before the UN, the camera cut to the German delegation and they were rolling their eyes. They thought he was just completely, full of it. When in fact, if you go back and listen to that speech, he nailed it.
Well, and I remember some of those reports. During the Obama administration, there were reports coming out saying that Putin was planning to use energy as a tool of influence, and it didn't seem like it was taken that serious. What do you feel was missed in that whole discussion? There were intelligence reports on it. What was missed?
Well, what was missed was, I think, in their heart, they knew we were correct, but they just could not give up the cheap Russian energy. Yeah. And what I point out in the Envoy, in my new book, is that not only did we warn them, but we offered an alternative. We took the European energy minister to Louisiana. We got him on Air Force One, which was not easy to do, to get a foreigner on Air Force One. He rode with the president and with me and others. And we opened a new LNG plant in Louisiana. And that energy that was going to come out of that plant would have been largely dedicated to crossing the Atlantic and providing Europe with an alternative. And everyone was very excited about it, but the Germans couldn't help themselves. They really were hooked on this cheap Russian energy. And Chancellor Merkel, I don't think, believed that there was any kind of a possibility that Putin would do what he's actually doing right now.
And speaking of the energy and, love of Russian gas, it seems Ukraine's President Zelensky says he is open to peace talks with Russia, and that's something he's been, vehemently against just a few months ago. And it seems the U.S. has been nudging Zelensky to publicly say he'd be willing to talk to Russia. So what are your thoughts on this?
Well, Zelensky has also been very clear that he expects full compensation for all the damage that Russia caused, and he expects Russia to leave not only the newly occupied areas in Ukraine, but also Crimea. That's going to be a tall order for the Russians, but I think Zelensky at least is showing a willingness to talk, which is fine.
On that note too, if and when the war does end, what does the rebuilding of Ukraine look like? A lot of Americans I know it's mixed. Some people think we're doing a great job helping them. Some people are unhappy with the amount of money.
It's going to be the mother of all infrastructure projects, is what it's going to be.
Yeah, because I've watched videos. It's decimated.
It is decimated.
What is the U.S. role going to be in that, do you see?
Well, clearly that's where, the U.S. is always the first responder when someone has a problem that we want to protect. And my feeling, and I would imagine the feeling of any of my colleagues on the Republican side, would be, okay, we took the military risk, even though we didn't have boots on the ground. We still took a significant risk. I think it's time for the rest of the world to now coalesce around Ukraine and let them write some of the larger checks for the rebuilding. Not that the U.S. won't help, but I don't think we should be in the lead on that part of it. We need to restock our armaments that we've now expended in Ukraine. That's where we need to spend our money.
Well, Gordon Sondland, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you.
Thank you. It was really nice to be with you.
And coming up after the break, we have General Robert Spalding. He's an Epoch Times contributor and senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. We'll look at what China means for our manufacturing and more in just a minute after a quick break. Welcome back to Newsmakers. Joining us now is General Robert Spalding. He's an Epoch Times contributor and a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. General, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you back on the show.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So, General, to begin, what's your take on China lifting COVID restrictions, specifically the back and forth on COVID lockdowns?
Well, I don't think that Xi has changed his stance, and so I don't think there's anybody that's willing to go against, what his stance is on zero COVID. I do think it's more related to their ability to control the population than necessarily the diseases, but it's really hard to say where it goes from here. I think they're going to continue to keep the zero COVID in place until they make a decision on Taiwan.
Well, and on the note of Taiwan, I mean, everybody is wondering, is Xi going to invade Taiwan? I know he keeps talking about war plans. He keeps saying he's going to do it, and he keeps not doing it. What is the reality of this? Is there a chance he could invade Taiwan?
Well, I think they're trying to determine, what is the best time for them to do it. I don't think we're going to know. I don't think it's anything that you can necessarily predict. They're not going to show their hand like the Russians did in terms of Ukraine. So I think it's going to be a shock to everybody. But my belief is it could happen at literally any time. So it's just something that we're going to have to be ready for, because it literally could happen anytime.
And General, on that note about preparing for a potential war, with the midterms in the control of the Congress still kind of up in the air, do you see China as a bipartisan issue and, military funding?
Well, I think it's a bipartisan issue when it comes to national security and foreign policy. So within, the Washington, D.C. Beltway, national security people, foreign policy people agree that we have a challenge with regard to China. The problem is, when you're looking at implementing policies that would deal with the challenge as it is, one of the biggest one is, do we have control of our own supply chain? What you run into is a lobby from corporate America and Wall Street. So while, say, the Department of Defense, the Department of State are very aware of the challenge, Congress on both sides of the aisle is aware of it, the National Security Council is aware of it. When you start to get into the Department of Commerce and the Department of Treasury and the National Economic Council and the White House, what you're going to find is far more unwillingness to push China in the ways that need to be pushed. Our challenge with China is that they have the ability to move our political processes in ways that are counter to our interests. And so whenever we try to have a policy that deals with the fact that, for instance, we don't manufacture almost any pharmaceuticals at all, the China lobby steps up and says, well, we need to keep, our supply chains in China. We need to continue to trade with China. We need to continue to have financial relationships with China. So we can't really get out of the rut that we're in unless, on the corporate side, on the financial side, we start to pull out. And what I've seen, particularly since the 20th Party Congress ended, is there has been capital being pulled out of China. But, right 2 weeks ago, she invited a whole bunch of bankers to Hong Kong and got them on message about, hey, we need to continue to send money into China. So you have an ebb and flow going on, and we can never really get, where we need to go until we can finally break free of their control and their influence over our political process.
Well, and that ties into, I think, a bigger issue as well. When we talk about military threats from China, a lot of us are just focused on the military. And we can look at similarities between Russia and China on that. But what's missing from the discussion is that, we are deeply intertwined with China on supply chains, on investing, in business, in politics. It's different from Russia very, very much on that front. And on that note, do you think investors are actually still betting on China? Where do you see this whole thing heading?
Well, it's funny because I think they're waiting for some kind of signal that zero COVID ends, or that Xi is not really going to be ideological
and they're looking at the stocks in China and they're saying, hey, they've been beaten down this year. So all they need to do is do something to show us something, and you can see the money waiting to pour in. So I think, this is the challenge that we have, and that's why I've always been so concerned about it, because mostly what drives this relationship is greed. And, if there's a sign that, hey, zero COVID, for example, is gonna, even if there's a rumor, you see the price of Chinese stocks start to shoot up. So it's something that we have problems with. I think any democracy is going to have problems with until we finally break away and decouple.
Hey, General Spalding, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Folks, after the break, we have Dr. Scott Atlas, Epoch Times contributor and Hoover Institute senior fellow. Now, do we need a pandemic amnesty? That's coming up after the break.
Everything that's reported on television isn't always true, but it should be. NTD, the power of truth. Now available 24/7 on television and streaming platforms.
NTD's Capital Report. It's about getting answers. Cutting through the fog of politics. It's about your questions and our chances to ask.
What is the net impact of the American? Congressman Graves, thank you for joining us.
We're speaking to those in power to find out what does this mean for the people. We're here so you are in the know.
Navigating a world of economic madness, you need to have the right guide. What do today's decisions mean for your tomorrow? We ask why.
Nation speaks, we don't just scratch. Nation speaks, we don't just scratch the surface. We want to go wide and deep. Our viewers come away with a much richer understanding of the issues of the day. We really make a big effort to bring on different voices onto the show. We don't just talk to experts and newsmakers, which of course are extremely important, but we also want to hear from the American people. So the people who are impacted by the policies and issues that we're talking about, because what they have to say is just as important to the national conversation.
Welcome back to Newsmakers. Joining us now, Dr. Scott Atlas, Epoch Times contributor, Harvard Institute senior fellow, and Dr. Atlas. Thank you for being here with us.
Happy to be here.
Now, The Atlantic recently published an article calling for a pandemic amnesty. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the intent of the author is probably good. I don't question that, but I think there's several reasons why we don't just walk away and say, oh, okay, bygones be bygones. I mean, first of all, we have over 1 million Americans who have had their deaths attributed to the virus, and way more harms and deaths from the lockdown policy itself. This is very serious, and so the public needs to know the facts. The truth is critical here. We can't live in a society where the public, after having gone through everything that happened, is sort of just, it's brushed away like it didn't happen. No, I mean, the facts matter, the truth matters. Public needs closure and understanding what was correct policy, because the lockdowns failed. They failed to stop the spread of the infection. They failed to stop the death, and they were massively harmful. So the truth is number one. The second reason is we need to restore truth is number one. The second reason is we need to restore trust in institutions and our leaders who squandered the trust, partly by being grossly wrong, but mainly by simply suppressing the alternative view and trying to instill fear into the public instead of coming forward with data. The trust has been lost, and the way to restore trust is to admit error publicly. I think that's very important and the first essential step to restoring trust. And then the third reason is the accountability issue. If these people who are in power get away without any public disclosure that they were wrong, then they're likely to do it again. And we can never let this happen again. We had a massively harmful policy, an unethical policy, by the way, that broke all basic ethics of public health by shifting the burden of disease to poorer people rather than the affluent, by not counting the whole impact on health, instead just focusing on one single entity, COVID, and by harming the most vulnerable in society, which is our children, the elderly. I mean, we really broke the social contract with our children in a level that is really the biggest fiasco in public health in modern history. So the accountability of simply coming on, admitting you were wrong, is very important. No one's asking really, or at least I'm not, for any kind of punishment. That's not the point. But accountability by admitting error, egregious error, and admitting massive error on demonizing people who actually were correct, people like me who were correct every step of the way. But it's not the personal apology. It's simply to let the public know and to show the accountability. We can never let this happen again.
And Dr. Atlas, speaking of that accountability, it seems Republicans have been talking about investigating Fauci if they do win control of the Congress. So is that necessary? What's your take on that?
Well, I'm not into the witch hunt sort of thing on individual people. Now, there are reasons to do investigations, though. Number one, the real, public airing of exactly what happened needs to be done. I personally am very skeptical that a political investigation, no matter who does it, is going to be done without politics, or if it's going to be perceived as non-political. I don't trust people in government at all. They don't deserve to be trusted to be objective. But the second reason to do the investigation, frankly, is because there's a lot of things here talking about what was the motivation? What was the motivation to flip-flop multiple times with policy? Was there or was there not a cover-up of the funding of the research itself by the NIH? And if that was actually funded by the NIH during an era in American science when it was illegal to fund that sort of research from the Obama administration's own rules, I think that that's a very important thing to investigate and understand, because we cannot have illegal research being funded outside the country by American science just to avoid or circumvent the rule of it being illegal. And I'm not sure that was done. I know there was funding of research on this virus under the NIH, which of course is Fauci's division of the NIH. These leadership positions come with massive responsibility. It's not a game to be in charge of things. You're not supposed to use it to circumvent rules. You're not supposed to set up power, friends in the media to cover for you. No, you need to be at least answer the questions in front of the American people.
I guess just last question, 20 seconds. Should we hold China accountable? This was talked about early on. What do you think needs to be done with that?
Well, of course. I mean, this is the biggest healthcare crisis in modern history. And not only was China not held accountable, which is where the virus originated, and then delayed admitting that there was a serious problem going on. So yes, the world needs to hold China accountable for that kind of behavior. That kind of behavior is unacceptable. It's outside the range of norms and ethics that are expected of a society that is accepted into the world's peace-loving societies. I mean, this is a very serious problem. From what I understand, they blocked real investigations. They destroyed evidence of what happened. Of course, they need to be held accountable. It needs to be done, though, by a government and multiple governments that actually have the credibility and ethical focus to do that. And I think that remains to be seen.
Yeah, great points. Dr. Atlas, thank you so much for being here.
I appreciate that. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, well, interesting times we're in. You know, folks, really this is kind of a time of limbo right now. We're still waiting on answers with the midterm elections. We're still waiting to see the challenges. We're not going to get answers on it just being realistic until probably December. You know, we're going to see some runoff elections and lawsuits. This is just the reality. We will be keeping you updated on all of this as information comes out. And, you know, a lot of things are going to happen as well. I think we are going to see really new investigations take place. I really see, actually, in the coming year, kind of an opening up of the lid. We're going to see what was happening behind the scenes, very likely with Hunter Biden's laptop. The other side of the January 6 investigations, if, again, Republicans take the House, which they very likely will. Maybe we'll see investigations into Fauci, into the NIH, into possible Chinese research. It's going to be an interesting time ahead.
Definitely lots of different stories to keep looking out for. And it seems one big point, right, to keep in mind is what are some of the bipartisan issues that we can learn from, especially with, you know, the midterms still in limbo here. But we'll keep you updated here on Newsmakers. That's from all of us here tonight. And we'll be back next Wednesday with a brand new show. See you then.